I'm up for that.
Aha.
Live.
Consenting to be recorded. Okay, I have to watch my language now.
You know.
Okay, fair enough. Good to know.
We're about consent, folks. We're about a lot of things, actually. Oh my goodness, people are still streaming in. I am just so gobsmacked to be here with you at this lovely hour
of many hours, all the hours.
After having traveled all over the globe. I'm Angela Gunder. I'm one of the co-hosts and co-chairs of OLC Live. And I'm joined here with Clark Sean Elson.
Hello.
Partner, champion in all things. Excellent Tyrannosaurus Rex dancer. He's got some good moves. Yeah. You know, after hours, it's a little, I mean, I shouldn't even have a jacket on. We shouldn't even have jackets on at this point.
Take off the jackets.
Okay. Get him out of here. Yeah, loosen that tie. Oh Nate, no.
This is really,
it's getting real. It's getting real. Expansive moves. I am Kate. We are so happy to have you here too. And I love Vietnamese hotel Wi-Fi holding steady. That is my next tattoo that I'm gonna get somewhere on my body in honor of this auspicious event. So speaking of auspicious events, we have covered much ground today. We have had incredibly inspiring and generative conversations. We've had challenging conversations, but this has been a place of respect. It's been a place of transparency and trust, all of the things that we've known that we needed to do in order to create impactful change around openness. And we just started this out with the goal of defining openness in global context. But what I really feel is that we've spent this entire day preparing for this last session, which Sara, Lambert, Johanna Funk, and Kate Bowles are going to lead us in. This will be a slight departure from the format of the day, especially for those of you that have been following along for the entire day. I applaud all of you. There are badges that we should definitely be handing out for your perseverance and for your willingness and generosity throughout the day. So the format, for those of you that are just joining for this one just now, is pretty simple. Basically, we have a collaborative Google Doc that has a series of readings and resources and gifts to give to all of you in hopes that you will then contribute to the answering of the questions that we have here, in the hopes of us synthesizing the data, the information, the findings, the questions, the challenges into a white paper that we'll distribute. And as I've said in all of the other sessions, it's really important to us that we honor your contributions. So if you do add to the conversation, and Nate has dropped the collaborative worksheet into the chat, we just ask that you put your name and your information there so that we can make sure that you're credited for your work, but also, which came about, I don't know, maybe session 4, if there are folks that are interested in helping us to synthesize the findings from these sessions too, that open work that we're going to be doing is in fact open to you. So reach out, don't be strangers. This is the beginning of a continuing conversation. In fact, I think saying it's the beginning is a little bit presumptuous. We are entering into a conversation that is already thriving and going. This is just one sort of conduit or channel for that raging river of a conversation. So that is...
You are a mountain of metaphors. I love
it. So yes, we will absolutely open any contributions. We'll absolutely welcome any metaphors. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sara's. I think Sara's going to lead us. She's going to Sherpa us through this last provocation.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see the people flowing into this event. And And I must admit, you prepare, and then you see on Twitter 24 hours before all this huge sharing of excited people, and you think, maybe I should prepare some more. but no, it's okay. We're sorted. But I'm not doing any slides. I have already used up my one PowerPoint per week quota this week, and can't just stretch any further. So I'm just going to, I have some notes, and I want to just give some intro and move through into the provocation. So I'm Sara Lambert. I'm currently at Deakin University, so working out of Melbourne in the southern part of Australia. So it's only a short hop over from Melbourne to Tassie, and then to the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. So we are 9 months of the year in a polo neck skivvy, and couldn't be more different to where my friend Johanna Funk is, up in Charles Darwin Uni in the very north. And I think you're probably closer to the Indonesia and PNG major cities than I am. So we inhabit regions within regions, and Australia is a big continent with lots of region specificity. So that's not only the geographic, but where we sit in relation to other regions, I suppose, and other cultures. So Kate is currently at Wollongong Uni, where I actually used to be for a long time, and that's on the eastern seaboard as well. So we've got these interesting crossovers. So we are all from Australian higher ed institutions today, and that will become clear, I think, that we'll talk from that perspective. I did put some notes in the Google Sheet just about the other parts of the supposed Oceania region, which is, no one has a "I love Oceania" bumper sticker on their car down here. It's just not a thing. So I think that's just the bit left over that someone else decided was just that bit down there. So it's kind of not that helpful to think about it in this way. And New Zealand has its own distinct history. First Nations peoples in the Polynesian area, and boating and seafaring stuff, and the Australian Indigenous people in Australia, have our own, different kinds of history. So, yeah, actually, if you Google Australian Indigenous languages map, you'll just get this most amazing perspective of the diversity of language groupings within our place. So that's a place with lots of distance. And so in terms of our history of education, we have large regional and metropolitan-based higher education institutions, and we've done a lot of e-learning for a really long time because you just have had to do it. So distances are really big. We started off with, schools of the air. We did planes, we did radio. We're still doing a bit of that. So we sort of got on this e-learning shenanigans quite early, and I would say that it's pretty mainstream in most institutions. So there's been a lot going on, and from our part of the world, we're pretty active. Now, Kate, did you want to chip in with some international context at this point?
Yes, I had to find my unmute. Yes, so the reason that I'm in Vietnam at the moment is that Australian universities have a much bigger sense of their territory than the continental Australia. So I work in internationalization of Australian universities, and we do this in two ways. One, we aggressively recruit from across our region, taking our region to be Southeast Asia all the way up to China, for international students to come to Australia. And the importance about the aggressiveness of our extraction in this sector is that we cross-subsidize a bunch of other things that universities do by bringing international revenue in, very similar to European universities. And so that's an enormously problematizing way of approaching internationalization and open education, because this is the area that the universities have least incentive to be open about, because it's the product that they're selling. And the second way that we do this is via offshore campuses. So I did want to say, just as a kind of shout out, I've come here from our offshore campus in Hong Kong. And I think tonight well, wherever you are in the time zone, we are all really sobered by what's happening on Hong Kong university campuses. And that includes many students who think of themselves as belonging to Australian universities. So again, the question of open and closed becomes very, very complex when it comes to the management of citizens and their education mobility. That's my introduction as to why I'm here.
Now I'm finding my unmute button. Thank you, Kate. And so it's not an easy place, but what I wanted to pick up in my provocation is that from my perspective, I think at the moment, just because of what's going on in particular and how we do actually have quite a lot of conflicting gears, we have had a lot of more inequality actually happening in recent years. It's policies are not being great. Funding has not been great. We have, I don't know, there's a history of opportunism and fair go here, but it isn't playing out so well at the moment. And so I actually think that in this instance, for me, open education can actually be social justice as a kind of resistance. And I think that's important. I think it's something that can achieve some outcomes for a lot of people in our local context and make things better in our own way. And I think that I know that despite what Kate's talking about, the international pressures and the gear shift between this sort of economic closure and these other kinds of initiatives we have in Australia to widen participation and to fund mature age students, and we do actually have some quite reasonable funding policies for higher education and opening and widening access. But despite all of that clashing and difficulties, I think that, what am I saying here? We have to, I just think that we've got e-learning here, but despite all of the difficulties, some of us want to do openness exactly because it is hard, and we want to resist that. We want to resist our higher education becoming an economic product. We want to connect and respect with our students, and I know that Kate does this amazingly in her open teaching of her students and letting her students' voices come out and talk about their strengths and experiences and how they navigate these difficult spaces. And those kinds of acts of open education as social justice, as actually recognizing students' strengths, recognizing their experience, letting them have their own voice, that representation of their own experience, I think makes the place a lot more welcoming and provides a way in which we can be respectful and we can actually guide students to be respectful in this difficult space as well. So in terms of what I would say is, at the moment, open education globally, it has some overlaps with e-learning or online and distance learning in a general way. That's great. Australia's done a lot of that for a long time. I would say, as my provocation, that we can actually consider open education as social justice as a distinctive and really timely, important way that we can make that different, and we can make a difference. I think I might pause there.
I just wanted to plug into one thing that you said, Sara, too, about making open be a place of opposition against the paradigms that exist. It reminds me of, and I tweeted about this earlier, just a provocation that Lee Graves Wolf did at an event that Nate and I put together at OE Arizona, where she challenged us to think about how we're radically open. And I don't know if a lot of people, you know, as they enter into the open conversation, and we talked about this earlier, for a lot of folks, actually Emil said this, you know, how open is really open educational resources, and it's about cost savings. And it's just those two pieces. And that's sort of the foray into the conversation. But I think we need more of these invitations to say, how might we break down these ivory towers that are around us? How might we create seismic shifts in the landscape that are around us that will bring about the change that we want to see? And I think that there's a sense of resistance there. It's not all just, hey, we want to save money on textbooks. I mean, obviously we want our students to have equitable access to education, and the cost of materials is a barrier. But there are bigger pieces of this that we absolutely need to chip away at. So that was just—
That's right. Yeah, the economic dimension is one of those three principles of social justice. If you're in a position to be able to offer a free course and offer some free resources, that's a fantastic piece that you can do. But not everyone can work in that space. The other components of the social justice model have the recognitive and that identity recognition element. So we're actually recognizing the strengths of the diversity of our students and making it a widening participation space. We do a lot of that in Australia, policy-wise. We've got some funding to do that sort of thing. I'm interested in, if we do manage through these, our government does do enabling places. So if you're an Australian citizen, you have a really tricky road to education, you didn't complete your qualifications, you can do both online and face-to-face options for free enabling programs to get you into higher education that's funded. We've done things like that for a long time. So there are places where the economic piece is kind of quite positive, but not everyone can be that person. But once you get people into higher education, we have to make sure that that open door doesn't become a revolving door, which is what Sara talks about, right? And so we have to make sure that it's not offensive when they get in. And so, if you've got Indigenous students who only ever see white people in their resources, and a lot of international students having that perspective as well, women as carers and their experiences of running, say, $1 million community sports club, as like being kind of vilified for not having legitimate business experience compared to working in a bank. I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen all the time. So we have to make what happens inside as we have to recognize all of the strengths that students bring and stop seeing these kinds of, hate the term non-traditional students because they're more than the traditional students these days, but having to see that as some kind of a deficit moment, So recognitive justice isn't just about, putting pretty pictures of different colored faces in textbooks either. That's a really poor version. It's about recognizing the strength. It's about recognizing women as leaders, Indigenous people as entrepreneurs, gay people as leaders as well, women in STEM, just Indigenous people doing all the things, science, arts, everything. So we just want to see the power of what people are doing inside as well. And lastly, the third piece, the representation, is actually giving those communities, not just our students, but extending into their communities, particularly their regional communities, letting them come and build those sorts of resources and practices with us, because then you get this third piece. So what I'd suggest is if we think about open education as enabling social justice, then no matter where you sit, there might be a way you can contribute to one or two or three of those kinds of dimensions in some of the different work that you do. And I would posit that all of that is valuable because we create space between all of us for those practices that helps to actually create a safe space for a lot more people to learn. And that helps to counter this kind of gear change crunch that happens when you've got an economic closure and this kind of wanting to be open thing that Kate's talking about around the internationalization as one of the many kind of pressures that we face. So I should just chip in and see if Kate wants to add anything before we throw to Johanna to give us her marvellous talk and some great examples about what is happening in the far north.
I would like to just two things. Textbooks. Australia has a really, really long history of understanding the colonisation impulse in education. We've had centuries of free public education delivered in Australia by Britain, which was culturally inappropriate. And that legacy is being taken up now by American textbooks. I think we really have to say very, very clearly that the problem for textbooks in Australia is Australian content for Australians, because we're such a small market. So we end up instead with kind of borrowing American educational resources just as we predominantly watch American movies and American TV. So textbooks are both the problem and they can't be the solution. But the other thing I want to say, listening to Sara, I was really inspired by everything Sara said, but I noticed how often international students fall off that table of that thinking. So, and this is true in all of our policies, our government policies. The white papers written by our most progressive educators consistently talk about all Australians. In our universities and in our offshore campuses, we have a large number of people who are not Australians. And I really think that it takes an incredibly committed vigilance to keep saying, you know, all Australians, Indigenous Australians, and our international students on every topic. And some of the issues that Sarah's raised here about important cultural barriers to access to education literally do not extend to international students. So the Australian government funding for equity provisions in universities, some of them, and I have raised the question, why don't we do this for international students? It's Australian money, it doesn't apply to international students. So I think I just want to keep international students very much in our view before handing over to Johanna.
Well, thank you, Sara and Kate. There's a lot on our plate. There's definitely a lot on our plate. And I hope that some of the examples I'm about to chat to about the very localized context and experience we have here might help us think about the different dimensions and practical things we can do to include, not just include, but to change the way we do and manage and value different ways of thinking that all of our students bring. So I just want to acknowledge the custodians, the land on which I'm working and have been for the last 7 years, and everyone who's joining us from all over the place. I want to acknowledge also my supervisors, namely Gutta. So is it okay if I share my screen now? Okay, so this is one of the examples that I wanted to just launch right into. This is kind of like a biodiversity Facebook type of open platform. And this is my beautiful, I call her mother, Gutta. And she is a Waramiri elder and senior research fellow here at CDU, but also here at Northern Institute, which is a social policy institute. And this was a project that she and I did in 2014, populating her local ecological sightings of different species. This is a badar, and so it's a paperbark, a very, very particular species of a gum tree. And we just started populating this with some of her traditional knowledge about these species in her local area. And you can see how she's just completely appropriated a field here with the moiety that this species belongs to. In the Yolngu world, the world is divided into two kind of forces, if you will, Dua and Yiricha. And so this is a way of organizing the entire world and who can talk about what and who can tell what stories. And this is the ancient authority that's been sown and baked and generated from old song lines and these things that you may have heard familiar terms about, and that everyone's languages and families and kinship structures are all tied to. So it's a whole worldview and way of organizing information. And so instead of being compliant with the fields on this site, Gutta occupied it with her knowledge, authority, and how she sees the world. So instead of filling in a Latin term, she talked about how she organizes information. And then there were different fields that she chose to share different information about. We're just going into this season now, so I showed you that. There are 7 seasons in the Yolngu seasonal calendar, and everything smells really sweet right now with the scent of this honey and eucalyptus. So it's very humid at the moment outside. So this is all tied very much to context. And so when thinking about the social justice elements and the ways that this is open to provoke you into thinking about a way to define how open this is, it's open to her language, first and foremost, the way we've privileged that first. It's open to her worldview and the knowledge authority, and it kind of redistributes the value and worth of how different information gets promoted and shared, and on whose terms as well. Because this original website, Bowerbird, was a citizen science project from the Atlas of Living Australia. And so it aggregates all these sightings into that database. So there's a really interesting segue to then talk back to some of the things. I'll just put the pretty picture up for a second. Some of the things that you were discussing about students being data points and content creators and income generators for the higher education sector here in Australia, is that, you know, the acknowledgement of their participation in this sector and their contribution of social currency and cultural currency as well in shaping our intellectual progress here. As data points, it's not really a reciprocal relationship there that recognizes the value and worth that they're contributing. So moving right along, I'm just going to try and be as provocative and quick as I can. Another example of openness was this. This is East Arnhem now, a different section and language group altogether. And these are really interesting little resources that we did for fisheries enterprise and aquaculture development at Warrawee in the East Arnhem region for fisheries research. And
hey, Johanna, I'm not sure if the screen has changed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep. We'd love to see the things.
New share. Oh, geez, that's the one.
Just me?
Okay. No.
Cool. Perfect.
How's that? Okay.
Thank you.
So the sticking point for these resources is that they were all authored by these people who narrated them and who chose the footage. I was just a glorified camera holder. And so they chose the language that they speak because they speak about 5 languages, some of them 2, some of them upwards of 5. Different dialects as well. And these were sea cucumber harvests, and they're developing an oyster farm here. And you can track this little bit of progress, but there's all this aquaculture and scientific, organizations involved and lots of stakeholders. And old things too. I mean, the Makassar people used to travel down from the Indonesian areas and trade with people along the northern Australia coast for trepang. So there's this beautiful history as well of benevolent trade relationships because Makassans would leave. However, the great thing about these resources is that they chose their own licenses, and that ended up being something a little bit more restrictive in nature because they wanted to protect the knowledge that they created and worked on. And I've been challenged that that's not really an open resource. If it's not really an OER if they haven't put a completely open license on it. So I would argue, and I would promote that perhaps it is open to their knowledge authority, their local context, their enterprise development, their access to the redistributive social justice and economic elements of them building something beyond a social enterprise, which is oftentimes what happens in remote Indigenous communities. This is a kind of attack onto the welfare system, and big successful businesses very rarely happen because of all this distance and all the historical complications that come with trying to do this. Can't get into at the moment, but I'm sure you might be aware of those. So this is a really provocative, I think, version of open to help us think too about ways that we acknowledge the language backgrounds and the way people organize and want to represent their knowledge and the content and the data and their participation in our education and economic systems. And ways that might generate a little bit more ways to, as Sara said, to connect and care for our students, regardless of what's going on, because that's our job. I don't know how much more time I have, so I've just been rambling. How are we doing?
You're great, and if you have more to share, you can. This is
I do. I have one more little one. that I worked on with the plant biosecurity project that I circled back. I started with Gutta, and there's another supervisor I have with, or two of my supervisors, Pai Linda Ford and Ruth Wallace, who's the director of the Institute and the dean of our college. And this is an Indigenous engagement model that we worked on with a big international team. There's a version from Indonesia as well as New Zealand. And so this is the Australian version of what happens when we have this massive coastline, and a lot of it is in the north is owned by our traditional custodians, and they're kind of wards of it. So they would have a vested interest in how these coastlines and the species get managed. Up until this point, there's been a lot of investment in Indigenous ranger programs, and they have had a lot to do on country management and management of incursions. However, the department of that manages biosecurity and I guess what you would call food security and resistance to kind of plant diseases and animal diseases. It's a big thing in Australia. So we had a huge thing happen with bananas a few years ago, and everyone had to kill all their beautiful heirloom ancient banana plants because there was this fungus that was happening. And so the ways that was managed was quite top down and treated people in communities like had to comply. This changes the dialogue. So again, it's a very particular social policy area, but you think about how this redistributes power over how we communicate and how we create dialogue with people from a compliance type of relationship to a more partnership, and really honoring the time frames that people want to build relationships and knowledge management kind of practices around. So again, bringing that back to how we might want to do this with students and in education is just to create different ways to make space and time to respect that people might have different definitions of what biosecurity might look to them on their country, and who the right people and who the right relationships that you need to build with are. I mean, some of these things we forget when we're coming at it from a very Western or techno-scientific perspective in some of our design of our platforms and how we interact, which is why I was really excited to try this provocation as something I've never done before. So I'll stop talking and I think I'm really excited about the collaborative document. So if anyone wants to say anything or mention any comments, I can stop talking.
I had just jotted some things down in the chat that were really compelling to me, and you had me thinking about Halliday and social semiotics, just this notion that we make meaning collaboratively, we don't make meaning in isolation, that it's negotiated over time, that it honors the cultures and the environments from which we come into, and yet we have, you know, these harmful binaries that are created within education of it's either this or that, you know, it's one or the other. When in actuality, we know that that isn't the case. We've seen that for thousands of years, that that's not the case, that it's not the separation of this or that. So your work is so compelling just to see evidence of this in action, and within a discipline that perhaps, just as I think it was Nate that perhaps, or maybe it wasn't in the collaborative doc, I was guessing, whoever was commenting about the degree to which Western scientific categorizations reign. It's almost like they're considered gospel and untouchable, and this is challenging that notion and getting us back to this idea that we're all in this together. It's like, oh, maybe it was me. Whether it was or not, you should claim it for sure. So.
Yes, well, just, you know, I really appreciate that, because it makes me think of the science that Gutta practices every day, and that knowledge is so deep and old and attached to so many things that Western scientific kind of categories, you know, there are boxes for the information that there are no boxes for some of the information that exists. And so when we think of those box terms and those either in or out of a certain category, there's it really ignores the multiplicities of ways of knowing and being and doing that I've only just scratched the surface in the last 7 years, you know, working here and learning. So it really gives me pause when I start, you know, I'm in Blackboard Ultra training today at the other side of campus, and thinking of ways to kind of, you know, engage with the hundreds of students that we get every semester, and wherever they're from and whatever they're bringing with them, you know, ways that we can really open up to their backgrounds and their realities.
That's such great examples, and I just think I wanted to just touch base with this notion of the public record of what is open. So something that really was important to me writing papers and publishing in the last couple of years was that I've been talking to educators who are doing more diverse notions of openness, more justice versions of openness. And at conferences we would attend, there would be, I think, a fair weight of people interested and passionate and doing that kind of work. But when I kind of started doing my PhD, it was so very hard to find actual academic literature that discusses that kind of work. And so one of the many things that drove me to move in that direction was to try and begin, you know, with others, of course, correcting that academic record of what open can do. And I still think there is just a lot of work to happen in that academic sphere. And to that end, I think that was why I was really passionate and joined with and invited Laura Chernowitz to help me edit a collection of open education and social justice that we're working on right now, because there's going to be, you know, we need to explicitly make time to surface and encourage people who are doing this kind of work to get it published out there, so we can have a greater sense in that academic record, which, you know, drives some of this higher ed space to acknowledge in that way these different kinds of knowledges and practices as well. So I'm super excited about the trajectory that that's taking. I really think that we are seeing a critical turn of open education, and that Southern folks are kind of big in that, and other places too. But I'm just thinking South Africa's been really strong. And you know, we have that chair of now, Cheryl Hodgkin-Williams, of you know, open education and social justice as the UNESCO chair, which is just such a big move. But for those of us who kind of were working in that space, it was enormously vindicating, actually, because you sometimes feel like a bit of a fruit, you know. So it's kind of nice to have a little bit of establishment to go, yeah, this is a thing. You know, it does help as well, particularly help us manage some of that talking back that has to happen within the sort of upper echelons of that higher education space, which is, you know, super status sorted. So, you know, that's an area that I'm you know, put my white lady hat on and go and have a crack, you know. They seem to be okay with me so far. I haven't over provoked, although there's always a chance that might happen.
I really like what Robin's question here about open as useful, and, you know, speaks to what you just mentioned, Sara, about what open does. I mean, that's one thing that we did a grad cert in the Yolngu Studies program here at CDU, and it's available online. So just plugging that, if anyone wants to have a look at the Yolngu language and culture and philosophies that Gutha has helped shape here. So the understanding of things moving and things being a verb and things performing openness, and not in a cheesy performative way, but in ways that are process oriented. And I think a lot of the cost benefit association of open is wonderful and a huge social justice mark, but I think it also helps distract a little bit about all the other things it can do and be helpful for. And, you know, the ancient knowledge authorities that I've only just started to learn about aren't completely open. They have many rules and statuses and closed and authority structures around them, and for certain reasons too. So it's a bit of a provocative idea, but it can help organize how we manage knowledge in respectful and responsible ways. So speaking to Sarah, Robin's question about the fragility about that, I think it's so context embedded, and it's so related to the, you know, some of the openness about a global indigeneity that are starting to present in some of the international students that are joining us from India and Nepal, for example, and other parts of the world, where you know, indigenous status is not considered the same way, and it's not a it's not something that is a popular thing to talk about. And it's actually, so some of the fragilities of being open about your background as well, and your knowledge and your language, is problematic. So some of the Western pedagogies that we take for granted and get excited about might be something we need to consider.
And I think for myself, I have very intentionally moved out of EdTech altogether into social justice and into being an equity practitioner, and that is a thing that can be done in some places in this country. So I'm really happy in that space. But I do find although I don't use the term openness myself, I find it really unhelpful and fuzzy, and I'm kind of really done with it, and sometimes I'm even really cranky with it. But I don't give a rat's what openness is, you know. Yay, done. But I really care about justice. So one of the communities that is talking about that happens to be comfortably called Open Ed, and there's just amazing connections of people who are passionate about that. So I think the open is actually professionally, it's about staff being open to each other. I think that's hugely valuable, but I don't really, it's kind of a shorthand. I don't know, it's like a badge, you know, maybe we just, you know, have that badge. But so I'm really proud to engage with that and have that history of 20 years of EdTech doesn't just go vamoose, but that for me has just become standard business as usual, what everyone does. So now the equity practitioners are all going online. Everyone's online. Whoop-de-doo, you know. So what is distinctive? You know, for me, it's always been about justice. And I was just like that square peg in a round hole, you know, at the end of the day in EdTech, because a particular place I was in turned into a kind of a shiny vendor spectacle of executive persuasion. So it can't do that. So have just made a move, but that's okay, because there's lots of people who can move in that space still, you know, and I love that they can still do that. And I love that they're still passionate about working in that space, but you know, we have our own journeys, and I feel really comfortable in those two worlds.
Well, this is also another thing that I'm thinking about when you talk about shiny, what determines open. I mean, those videos that I did with the staff at Yagbani Aboriginal Corporation at Borrowee on their enterprise development and their science that they were using to build their oyster and trepang businesses. We were using like iMovie and old cranky laptops with, you know, really crotchety technology. We were not using these big sexy drone footage and, you know, huge data, because, you know, you go 50 kilometers south of the Barama line here and you've got no mobile reception, and, you know, data in these communities is withheld by schools and clinics, and people are on flip phones and pay-as-you-go plans. So when you start thinking about access to managing this stuff openly on platforms like this, the offline openness version, you know, what do you do when you have no data or the electricity goes out, which happens here a lot. So this level of openness and to, you know, those types of realities and how we do things.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think, you know, if I position openness as a social justice and a resistance to some of the sort of unhelpful things that are happening in higher ed, then I come to the position of being really happy if it's not rolled out as some monolithic thing, you know, if it doesn't become the big mainstream thing. I don't know if that's really practical for us to think that we're going to take over the world with the openness
next
thing.
Big thing.
The next, yeah, which sometimes I think when you read like the UNESCO declarations, it's like bum ba-dum ba-dum. But we're too local. Everyone, I'm really advocating for think global, sure, but act local. Really think about who needs the justice in your local area and think, and I find people often really enthusiastic about, you know, helping poor people other places, but don't really do so well at recognizing who needs justice in their local environment. So, you know, in the current context of what's happening in open science, it's like, you know, all the women they've ever worked with. So, you know, we can do more locally with our openness. We can be open to who needs justice and some attention in our local communities in the way that Johanna's doing really locally, contextually specific work, and super powerful, super inspiring for us. We need to think about how we can actually enable our own regional communities. And if that means that, you know, that empowers people to do that, that's terrific. I'd be happy for us to not roll out in some global sense.
Onboarding low openness, as Nate's suggesting. I do think that I totally agree with you. And I've often cited you, Sara, openness, determinism. And there's a kind of thing like learning happens outside our units at our courses.
Yes.
Learning happens outside the LMS. The training framework those clips came from, you know, this is just like choose your own adventure stuff. People pick and choose the learning, and just because they don't complete your unit doesn't mean they're not doing something with it. So that's that authority, it's their learning, right? So this is the authority over knowledge that I'm kind of using as a broad, expansive term that people have, and we, you know, as teachers, we want to encourage that agency over all of that and not control it.
But I think just to finish and respond to, I think, Robin's comment about, you know, there are some of us who really can't imagine open without social justice, but we have to realize that there is just a huge number that don't really, you know, and so it is an ongoing conversation too that we keep needing to have and finding ways to legitimize and support each other in this kind of practice, because as I said, you know, when it comes to, you know, who gets to speak on these kinds of issues and who gets funded to do these kinds of projects and who gets funded to keynote. It's an interesting conversation we won't touch on now, but, you know, and who gets time in their workload to write papers, as I touched on before. So I think there's quite a bit of resistance to be getting on with. And so I was quoting Tara Yosso and her resistance capital as one of the key aha moments I had in my reading for my thesis of the different kinds of capitals that students bring. And yeah, I think as I talk to, well, first observation in the Australian context, we have 50% of our higher ed students allegedly are first in family. But I would say folks of a certain generation like mine who came through free education, there was a moment there when that happened, really numerous at the moment in mid-management of Australian universities. And they are volunteering because they got a go at free education, and it really tears us up to see how much damage is done by, you know, the pressure we have our students under these days to be able to eat, pay the rent, or, you know, and study. So, you know, there's a lot of resistance capital in the system, and we're all practiced at building up ways to resist being marginalized, you know, in terms of our opportunities and in terms of our voices, and you get better at that. And that's another strength, I think, in the whole system. And I see that a lot in this group I kind of identified before, like the open, the open network, whatever that is. I wonder how many first geners and how much resistance capital we would all have. But it's got to play out in our regional, particular local context, I think, to make sense. We should really work in that space, and I think we can make a difference.
Hear, hear.
Curious what Robin would say.
I'm just like so grateful right now. I cannot tell you, honestly, I'm gonna maybe like not even be able to say anything because I'm just gonna start crying, but the inspiration I take from the three of you it's the kind of leadership that refigures everything we know about leadership also. And I just feel like this is, I mean, and this is what I've always loved about like what I see coming out of OER 19, OER 20, and like, it's just a different way of thinking about a movement. You know, it's less about centralization and organization. And it's more about, I mean, we were trying to get at this a little bit earlier, and that's why I feel like it's just so brilliant to have this at the end of the day, because we just saw so many pieces of it. But it's really about how to be alongside. It's about how to listen. So honestly, I'm not going to say any more, because that's, for me, it's just been taking this in is so wonderful. And I'm so grateful to you and to Kate, who, you know, is somehow still here, but not here. Thank you so much for this work, and for actually all the work and the stuff you've been writing over the last year or two as well that led up to this.
Yeah, thanks so much for saying that. For myself, I just beaver away, head down, rear up, and really appreciate an opportunity to air some of these provocations. I seem to be a string of provocations, but you know, it's really lovely to get that feedback and to also understand how it, you know, may have connected with what happened before, which unfortunately I couldn't get into for various facts that it's in the middle of my work day. But really lovely to hear that reflection. It's validating for the times when, you know, you do feel, I think, doing some of this work, there are many times you feel like an absolute fruitcake. And it you know, it just sometimes so disconnected from that mainstream discourse that you just can't speak to it. You know, it takes a lot of energy to gather those resources to be able to speak to it. And so for myself, I'm learning to really hold my energy so I can try and find those spaces when it's going to be effective, and you know, hopefully get a bit better at when those moments are ongoing. It's a work in progress personally anyway. So I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you so much.
Me too, Robin. That's amazing to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you did make her cry, I think.
So who wants to do a Google Doc?
I'm the hugest shucks person.
I wouldn't possibly do that to us. Actually, folks have been working in the Google Doc the entire time.
Wow.
Let me see.
It hasn't been independent of this.
I can't multitask. It's not my thing.
Well, you've been filling our brains with all sorts of ideas that we've needed a way to capture them immediately so we don't lose them. So folks have been doing the good work with that. I
love this Google Doc. I love it.
That in and of itself means that today has been a success. That folks could love a little old Google Doc. You know, there are all sorts of connections and extensions that have happened today. So, no, I think the best thing for us to do is to turn it over to Nate to talk a little bit about how we can continue this, how this is not ending now in this moment, and how we're going to make sure that we do good with all of the ideas and the challenges that we've been presented with today.
So first of all, I want to apologize because I'm in this very noisy hotel. Is my audio okay for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay,
not bad. A little bit of gurgle, but we'll cope. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I won't talk for very long, and I just want to say that you'll see in the Google Doc that the resources that you all shared are also linked now, where possible, to versions of them where annotation is enabled. And one thing that was really cool, actually, about Johanna's resources were that because they went so far beyond just words, and because hypothesis is such a logocentric tool, they're actually not as easily annotatable using hypothesis as things that have more words attached to them. And I found that a really interesting challenge. But I will remind folks that even though hypothesis really needs to anchor to words, you can put anything in an annotation. And so when we go back to this question of, you know, the orality and the logocentrism, annotations are not required to be words, even if hypothesis sort of requires them to be hooked words right now to work. So that's an interesting idea that came out of that. I bet it's getting even harder to hear me right now. So I won't say much more, but that I think part of the process that we'll go through with this beautiful Google Doc is collating and bringing together all the resources that have been shared as a kind of, not an annotated bibliography, but a bibliography to annotate, if you will. And that, I think, can be one of the outcomes of it as a rich set of resources that we can take away from it, in addition to all the great things that people said and recorded. So I will shut up there because you probably can't even hear me say anything with this noise. And thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nate. We just have to end with so much gratitude for Sara, for Kate, whom we've lost via the internet, but we're not bound by the internet alone. So she's still with us, and for Johanna showing her amazing, amazing work. This was such a special close to an incredible day, but I will resist the urge to think about this in terms of a closed and defined time and space. This is one blip in a continuum that's going to keep on going. So thanks for being part of this moment in the continuum and for contributing so richly. Just all the gratitude. That's all I've got.
Right back at you. It's been a really lovely process. I was a little nervous, but everyone made me feel right at home. So,
me too, Sara. It's
I
good.
know.
I
Totally. I'm like, so many people.
If I had known that you were nervous, I would have hollered at you. So
we just have to get the virtual salsa bar happening next time, I think.
Dudes, I got to get on a plane soon, so I'm going to do a runner and try and pack a bag. So
have a wonderful week in Florida, and stay cool and enjoy yourselves.
Thank you. You can actually, so if you want to see us and continue to talk to us, we have, I think Clark can pull up the rest of the schedule. We'll be here for the next 3 days, palling around. We have some kind of strange things that we're doing, like we have a design battle, and we have an online escape room, and all sorts of other things. But you know, we're continuing to have conversations with folks that inspire us, including tomorrow at 11, a talk about open within visual design practices, and some work that Adam Kurum and Ben Scragg and I have been doing for a little while. So excited about that, and excited about the ways that we can continue to connect over this. So.
I should probably just quickly mention and thank Adrian Stagg for the OER SIG that we have here in Australia, and encourage people in Australasia to get involved in that if you want to have these conversations. And he's organising like an openness pub quiz at our EdTech conference in Singapore. So there's lots of crazy good things happening through that SIG. Yep. Shout out to Adrian and the crew.
And if there are other places where you think people should connect, like throw them on the Google Doc. Robin, in her session before, she was like, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I'm like, no shame. This is a shame-free zone.
Yep.
Plug away. So yes.
Yep. I'll put it in the doc. Just thought of it then. Pew. Great.
Pew.
All right. Ciao for now.
That's what learning sounds like.
I've got to get back to learning Blackboard Ultra.
Oh, goodness. And thanks to
Bye, everyone.
Bye.